Hello, class. Today, we're going to talk about tips to help you proofread your papers. This is going to be an important class because all of the things I'm going to talk about right now are going to be things that you could use not only for the papers that we use in our class, but are also going to be tips that you can take with you outside of this class. So one of the biggest things that I would like for you to get out of this, as well as this entire writing class, is the ability to take what you're doing here and then transfer this over to other classes. But specifically, this will help you with all of your upcoming papers. So let me go ahead and share the screen now with my checklist for writers, checklist for papers. All right, so as you can see here, let me blow this up just a little bit. I have a checklist that I've created for all papers. And I say all papers. Not everything on here is going to apply to every paper that we write, but most of this information will apply. So I want you to take a look at this. This should be listed in the file section of Canvas, but also if you want another copy of this, please feel free to ask me and I'm happy to share this with you. So first off, we have some of the basic specifications. Now I put this on here so you would have an idea of what I'll be looking for with your papers. That said, nearly every other professor uses very similar specifications for papers. We like to use 12-point Times New Roman fonts. This is sometimes the default font, but it's not always the default. So it's better just to go ahead and switch over to this font. Not every professor wants to see this or needs to see this, and there's not a specific reason why. I'm not sure why Times New Roman font was the one that won out of all the other possible fonts that you could have chosen, but the universities as a whole, academia could have chosen, but for whatever reason, this is what they use. So you might as well get in the habit of using this one. 12-point is good because it's large and it's easy enough to see. Especially works well when you're printing up papers, but even in a digital space, we're just used to seeing this. And double space as well. So for printed papers, that's an important part because then we could write between the lines, make notes, and we can pass on our advice to you, suggestions to you. For a printed version, it might seem that it's, I'm sorry, for a digital version, it might seem that it's less important to do so. And on some level it is. But what people like to see when they read is just a little bit of space. They like to be able to look at the space on the paper and not feel overwhelmed by the text. This not only goes for the double space font, but then also if you think of large paragraphs, seeing large paragraphs for people, a wall of text is really difficult on the eyes and it's hard for people to read this with enthusiasm. So keep this in mind when you're writing your papers. So what we like to see is 12-point Times New Roman font, double spaced. So if you're not using it now, you might as well get in the habit of using this. Standard margins, of course, these are the ones that come along with the that are preset with the computer. However, sometimes for certain papers and specifically larger papers, you may have to change the font. So double check, ask if that's the case, but otherwise, this is it. Also a title. Might seem surprising that a title is important, but we'll say a poor title for a paper would be whatever the assignment is. So if you're writing a final paper and it just says final paper, that's a poor title. It doesn't make somebody want to read your paper. Remember with a paper, any kind of article, the first place where somebody is going to decide to read your work is in the headlines, in the title itself. So think about this as a newspaper. If you have a newspaper and you have a boring title that says bad thing happened today or man shot, but you don't have something else, what do you have to it? What are the lines that make somebody want to read this? So think about the titles and make them as interesting as possible, something that's descriptive, but then also would make somebody engage with your paper. Because in most instances, this is where you potentially lose an audience is with a title. So you want to try your best to have a really good, strong title for your paper, no matter what the paper is. Okay, unless somebody tells you otherwise, then my advice to you is to always try and get the best title possible. Name, class, and date, and all that stuff. Those are mostly important things to add onto your paper. And as well, word count. So for different professors, they might want the word count in different places. Some people might not care about word count. I do. And with the word count, what I would like for you to do is to put the word count right below the heading on your paper. So where it says your name, the class, the date, and the date in in MLA format is written in what they call military format or international format. And that's the day first, and then the month, and then the year, without any commas in between that. Other styles may have different ways to do this, Chicago style or APA, et cetera. I'm not 100% sure, but this is the way we do this in MLA, which is what we're using for all English classes. So we have the MLA format for this. And again, I would like to see the word count listed right below this. And if you're writing a paper, you should also ask with the word count if the word count is inclusive of the works cited page. Usually they're not. I go back and forth on this, so make sure that you ask before you check, before you use that. Okay. All sources should be cited in MLA format unless told to do otherwise. And so since I teach a number of students who have different, will use different style guides, I'm happy to let you experiment with other ones. You just have to let me know and be consistent all the way through it. So if you're using footnotes and you use Chicago style for that, then the whole paper needs to be in Chicago style. If you're not using footnotes, or if you're using some other format, then again, consistency is the most important thing that we could use for this. But just pay special attention to punctuation in this whole in the formatting process, because that's one of the most important parts of this. Okay. So let me move on here, talk about one of our greatest proofreading tips that I can pass on to you. One of the greatest proofreading tips that I found over the years is to read your paper out loud. I would strongly encourage you, before you press submit, before you send the paper in, before you give it to me, that you read this paper out loud. People will ask, why do you have to do that? Well, I say that you should read your paper out loud because when you've been typing your paper, often you've been writing for a long time and all of the information is in your head. You know exactly what you're trying to say. However, your reader doesn't know what you're trying to say. When your reader is looking at this paper, that's the first time that person is seeing it. So what might slip by your mind when you're reading the paper, especially if you're writing late at night or you're pushing the deadline, these might be small little things because you're trying to go through your paper quickly. If you read your paper out loud, I promise that you're probably going to find some errors. You're going to find some small minor corrections that you could have done if you had taken the time to do this. So my advice to you again is just to read your papers out loud. And I would also urge you to get your paper read by somebody else. At the university, we have the writing lab, but there may be other places that you could use this, other similar help that you can find. Tutors, would be a good one. But honestly, get a friend to read it. That would probably be just as good. Friend, partner, lover, boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. Feel free to get them to read your paper. Another set of eyes always helps. So you want to try your best to get that. And it's also a lot of work for somebody to read over your paper. Keep that in mind when they're looking at the papers. You might want to consider buying the person a cup of coffee or taking the person out to lunch or something. It's kind of a big deal to read over paper, especially long papers too. So just keep that in mind. It's just a nice gesture that you could do. But at the very least, you should read your paper out loud. And I would argue that reading your paper out loud might even be better than having a random person read your paper because, again, you know what you're trying to say, the class better than anyone else does. And with that said, you will probably have a stronger paper if you just do this one tip. Right. So next on the list is check for subject-verb agreement. And usually how I like to describe this is if you have ever been told that you have issues with subject-verb agreement, and almost always this has to deal with the tense in a sentence, then check it out. Let me know if you have any questions about that. I'm more than happy to help you with this. But it's essentially just making sure that the subject is matching the tense, that it's matching not only the tense as far as the singular plural sense, but then also that the verb is matching the subject itself. Delete passive voice. Passive voice is really tricky because it's hard to catch, and quite often we speak in the passive voice. And what happens when you write in the passive voice, though, is that you lose the agency of the subject. So there's a couple ways that you could check for this. One of the easiest ways that I find when you're going through your paper is just look for the word had or have in there. If you use helping verbs like had or have in a sentence, such as I have I had went to the store to get some milk. Instead of saying I had went to the store to get some milk, I could say I went to the store and get some milk. That in those instances, you don't need to use the extra verbs to add to this. I don't know if that's really the best example or a great example, but those are some good ways that you can avoid using the passive voice. Some people are more specific with this and really don't like it. Other people are a little more flexible with passive voice, but it's always best to get in the habit of taking it out. If you go on Microsoft Word, if you look under the review section, then you should be able to find a place where you have all of the tips where you can, all of the tools to help with checking for grammar, spell check, all those things. And I'll go into the one right here. And I'm not going to go to it right now because I don't think I could find it that easily. But if you look for it, you do a Google search to find out how to find this as far as the proofreading section goes. Find passive voice. You can click on all these different things. And I would suggest that you go and click on the passive voice, but also it doesn't hurt you to click on just about all of them. So all the things that you might think are things that you might not otherwise know how to look for, then that's a nice, easy way for you to check for it. So go ahead and look for passive voice. And when you find it, try your best to work around the sentence. And you might have to do a lot of restructuring of your work, but it's worth it in the end. Again, it makes it for a stronger sentence and gives the subject more agency in the work. Pronouns. When I say pronouns, the ones I'm specifically looking for in here are the word it and the word you. So I say to avoid the word it in your papers. And the reason for this is because it is a very vague pronoun. You want to make sure that when you're using pronouns that you're specific as possible. So in being specific as possible, you want to avoid vague pronouns like it. It can be used in many different ways and is often used incorrectly. So if you see the word it, make sure that it only has one antecedent that it could be referring back to, antecedent being what the pronoun is referencing. So you want to look for that. And if you can, then you might be using it correctly. But in almost all instances, the word it is used incorrectly in a sentence, or at least it's used stylistically in a bad way. So I would suggest that you try your best to take it out. Now, the word you is almost always used incorrectly in papers, unless you're speaking directly to somebody, as if you're writing a letter to somebody where you're asking somebody something specific, or you're addressing somebody specifically, which you're almost never doing in an academic paper. Then you want to make sure that you take the word it, you out. And the only exception to that I can think of, at least, is if you are quoting somebody. So if you're quoting somebody, then of course you're using their words and they're referencing the word you. That will happen, I'm sure, quite often. However, there aren't too many instances, and frankly, I can't really think of any instances where you need to use the word you in this paper. So in this instance for my classes, if you can substitute the word you for Mr. Satterwhite, then you're using it correctly. In almost all instances, though, you're not. So you might as well just get out of the habit of using that word. So in those ways, to do this, and what I would do is I would just go on, touch the control button and then hit control, hit F, and that'll give you the word search. And see if I can do it here and pull it up. And then look for the word you, Y-O-U. Here's it. And then it'll find all the words you in there. So you do this and you should find all the words that you should avoid. And from there, go ahead and take those words out. Okay. Anyway. You would be shy. Let me fix that while we're here. There we go. Okay. Now we'll go back here to pronouns. Okay, avoid ending sentences with prepositions. This is a little controversial, slightly, in the grammatical, in the grammar world. Some people say that pronoun or prepositions are a-okay, that they're grammatically sound to use at the end of a sentence, and other people don't. What I suggest you do is to go ahead and get in the habit of taking the prepositions out of the sentences at the end, or change around the end of a sentence to make sure that prepositional phrases are not in there. If you don't know what a prepositional phrase is, go ahead and look them up. Go on Google and look up commonly listed prepositional phrases. They're often very short words, 2 words, of, by, on. You know, those are generally prepositions. There's a long list of them. Go ahead and look up those words to make sure that that you know what they are and get a better idea of what prepositions are. And then from there, just go ahead and take them out at the end of the sentences. All right. And we go down here. And again, there's a little controversy about whether or not that's really an issue in grammar, but a lot of people think it is, and because so many people think it is, it kind of becomes a de facto rule. So again, you might as well just get out of the habit of ending sentences with prepositional phrases. Semicolons. So there's a rule for a semicolon, and quite often people get them wrong. The rule for a semicolon is on one side of the semicolon, you need to have an independent clause. An independent clause is a sentence, and a sentence has a subject, a verb, and it has to make sense. That's what makes up a sentence. So you have an independent clause on one side, and then the semicolon, and then an independent clause on the other side. And usually you have a conjunction that's bringing the two together. So an example of that would be, I went to the store, semicolon, however, comma, I didn't buy milk. So that would be something that you could do. But keep in mind that because you have these two independent clauses that are joined by a semicolon, that you could also put a period there, and that would be fine. If you take a look at books or magazines outside of academic journals, books or magazines, it's rare that you see semicolons. It's really rare that you see semicolons in newspapers, and it's because it's a kind of awkward punctuation mark, and usually it's not necessary. We use it a lot in academia, but if you use it, the general rule for semicolons is that if you use it sparingly. So if you have a 3 to 4 page paper, you probably shouldn't have more than 2 semicolons in the paper. And again, it's a general rule, but it's more of a stylistic thing. What a semicolon does, though, for a reader is that it forces a reader really to look at the semicolon and see that semicolon. It's not a punctuation mark that you go by easily. So because it stops a reader in their tracks, then in his or her tracks, then if you use it incorrectly, people pay attention to that. And a lot of people know the rules for semicolons, of course. And because a lot of people know the rules, that you may be judged, in your usage of the semicolon, whether you use it too much or you use it too little, or you don't use it at all. So it's good to know the rules when you're using the semicolon, and to make sure that when you use it correctly. And if you don't know how to use it, then you might consider not using it. But you should, of course, study the rule, make sure you know it, and then decide whether or not to use it. And also make sure that you know the difference between the colons. Colon and a semicolon, often people will confuse the two, and they'll use a semicolon when they mean to use a colon, and vice versa. So once you know the rules for the two of those, then go ahead and study them, use them if you need to, but again, be sparing with your usage of this. My next one here is its versus it apostrophe s. This should be fairly common or fairly obvious, and I know that most of you already know this, but just pay attention to it, because these words might be things that pop up, do not pop up on a spell check. So when you're doing a grammar check or spell check, this might not show up as being a problem, so you may miss it. So just pay attention to it. And also I listed a few of the common ones that people sometimes mix up. There, and they are. This is fairly common that people mix these up. And even writers who've been writing for a long time, when you're writing quickly, you may do this by accident. So just pay attention to it. Again, reading your work out loud really helps to find these. And also the difference between where and were. This comes up a lot more than you might think it would. So make sure that you know the difference and you're using these. Same with whose and who is. All right, so apostrophes. Now I put this on here, and again, there's a couple different ways that you could do this. I put this on here specifically when we're looking at dates. So if you're looking at dates, historical dates, and you're talking about the 1960s, then what you should do, and this is my hope that you'll do this, is when you write the 1960s, then you'll write it as we have indicated right here. So take a look at this, and I'll highlight it. 1960s like this instead of like this. And the reason that I don't feel that you should use this apostrophe is because the apostrophe doesn't really make any sense. This right here indicates plurals, and we're looking at 1960s being plural for the number of years, or at least indicative of the plural. So you have 1961, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way to the end. So to wrap it all up, then we have the 1960s. But this one here, apostrophe s, usually is either a contraction, or that it means it's possessive of something. And there's not really that in this. There isn't really a plural. I'm sorry, there isn't a possessive, and it's not a contraction. So as a result, then I would just go with this one right here. Although I've seen it written that both are used, both are interchangeable. I don't know if I agree with that, but yeah, you'll go with what you go with. For my classes, this one I prefer is that you use it like this. And if you're using the 60s instead, then it would just be the apostrophe and then 60s. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me about that. And again, there is some debate about that, but like a lot of things, especially in English grammar, there may be a couple different ways you could do this. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me or ask any other professor you have. Italics and quotation marks for titles. This is really common where people mix these up. So there's a couple ways you can remember how to do this, but it's best if you just put it in your mind somewhere. The major titles are in italics in MLA format, and this is the case with almost all other style guides as well. But it's major titles are in italics, minor titles are in quotation marks. So that means a book title would be in italics, and a story that's in a book, a short story that's in a book, would be in quotations. So for instance, if we were thinking of, let's see, if we're thinking of a Langston Hughes book. So there's a Langston Hughes book called the Collected Short Stories of Langston Hughes. The book, The Collected Short Stories of Langston Hughes, would be in italics because that's the title of the book. His short story, Breakfast in Virginia, that would be in quotation marks. So the major work is Collected Stories of Langston Hughes. That's in italics. And then the short story, Breakfast in Virginia, is in quotations. And the same thing with records would be the same, albums would be the same. So if you think of the album Purple Rain, one of my favorite records, if you think of the album Purple Rain, that would be in italics. The song Purple Rain would be in quotes. So I know that might be a little confusing, but maybe the song When Doves Cry would be in quotes and the album would be in italics. So just remember the major title, because the major title in an album, of course, is the entire body of the work, and then the smaller titles are in quotations. You should remember that because people get that mixed up all the time. And make sure that when you do the italics, of course, it's going to be the case for everything in the usage set. In the paper that you're writing. So if the story is about, or if the paper you're writing is about Claudia Rankine's book Citizen, then if Citizen comes up in the title of the paper that you're writing, then that would be in italics there. And then it'd be in italics when you write it in the book, write about it in the essay. And then it also would be in italics when you use it in the works cited page. So it's always going to be in italics. And same thing with quotation marks. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to let me know, ask me questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you do have. Avoid contractions and rhetorical questions in academic writing. So contractions, we've already talked a little bit about those, but those are can't instead of cannot, which is one word. Don't instead of do not. You want to make sure you use the longer version of that. So it's helpful for you, especially if you're trying to get up to a word count. You want to add that one extra word in most instances. So think of it as a benefit in that way. But also it makes the writing just a little bit more formal. So unless somebody tells you to use contractions, in journalism, often they want you to use contractions because it's an issue of space. But outside of journalism, then you want to go ahead and avoid the contractions. And also avoid rhetorical questions. I remember I had a professor once who, whenever we'd use rhetorical questions, he would answer these questions. So for instance, if I wrote a paper and it said, why does racism exist? And then he would scribble in the margins in there. It says, I don't know, this is your paper. You tell me, why does racism exist? This is your job, answer the question. So what I learned from this is that instead of asking questions like that, I should go ahead and answer the questions to the best of my ability, or reword the sentences or avoid them. So what I'll tell you to do in your papers, if you have rhetorical questions, is to go and turn those into assertive statements. So instead of asking a rhetorical question, just turn the sentence around and answer the question, because essentially that's what you're trying to do in the paper too. So what I shouldn't see in your papers are question marks, because there's no reason to. And I also, unless it's in a quote, of course. And I also shouldn't see exclamation points. Imagine an exclamation point as the equivalent of somebody standing on a table, yelling and screaming, fist in the air. And for academic papers, you really don't need to do that. You might need to do that in other forms of writing. If you're writing a manifesto, sure, use all the exclamation points you want. If you're writing a text message to somebody, great, do that there. In an academic paper, there's better ways to do this. You can just find better adjectives, or you can figure out a better way to make a strong exclamation, but just avoid the exclamation points in academic papers, as well as the question marks, unless you're writing quotes. There may be some exceptions to those two rules too, but that's what I would like to see. Now, one of our last ones here is don't end a paragraph with a quote. So don't begin or end a paragraph with a quote. So the reason you don't begin a paragraph with a quote is because you want to make sure that you're always the one in charge. The way you're going to use quotes is in the way that we've often discussed this as a quote sandwich. So a quote sandwich is a funny way to say this, describe this, is how your quotes are going to be used in your papers. So if you have a quote, then you need to have your quote introduced first. So you're introducing the quote, setting up whatever the quote is about. Then you're going to integrate the quote into a sentence. And then after you integrated the quote into a sentence, you're going to have the citation. And then following the citation, you're going to have an analysis of the quote. So an example of this would be, let me see, in the film Das Boot, the main characters are German sailors on a submarine. The author states, comma, and then you have a line, from the text, and then you have the citation. Well, that's in quotes, of course. In other words, what the author meant was this, and then you have the analysis. So essentially, you have the introduction. That was just off the top of my head, probably not the best quote, but if you have the introduction at the beginning, where you're introducing the quote, and that's a sentence by itself without a quotation, then you have the integration of the quote. So that would be the author states, comma, quotation, and then you have the quote, then you have the citation, and then after the citation, then you have the analysis. And if you have trouble with the analysis, you're not alone. A lot of people do have trouble with that. The best way that I can help you to get to thinking about the analysis is you should follow it up with something like, in other words, what the author says is this. So it's your job to translate that and tell me why it's important. Tell me why that is a quote that you're using in the paper. And I mention all of that to say that if you do everything that I just mentioned there, then there's no way that you could begin a sentence with a quotation because you haven't introduced it. So if you're not introducing the quotation, then at least for academic writing, you're in most instances, you're not doing it correctly. So you need to be able to introduce your quote and then integrate the quote, cite it, of course, and then afterwards, then you're going to analyze this. And if you do that, then there's no way that you would begin or end a paragraph with a quote for those reasons specifically. And that said, for almost all academic papers, especially fairly short papers, and I mean fairly short papers, under 20 pages, and even then still, I would say that even longer papers, really, that there's no reason to begin with a quote. We do this in books often, and you're not writing a book. So considering that you're not writing a book, then it's better just to avoid the quotations at the beginning of your papers. I know it looks kind of cool and looks pretty neat. And there's many of other venues where you can do this. You can turn your academic paper into a zine, and then you could use the quotation at the beginning of it. For this, just go ahead and avoid it. Throw it out and just jump right into the paper. So you want to do that in your papers. Avoid the quotes in the beginning. You also want to avoid the quotes in the introduction of the paper because this is where you're setting up the entire story, and then also, or the entire essay, and then also in the conclusion, you want to avoid that because if you're using a quote at the very end of the paper, then what you're essentially doing is you're introducing new material there, and you're not really going to be able to do an analysis, and you don't want to bring brand new material into the very last pages of or last paragraph, last lines of a paper. So it doesn't make as much sense to do that because you don't have the ability to give a final analysis of what your paper is about, which is basically what the conclusion is. So those are some of the tips that I have. I compiled this with the help of a professor over at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Mark Gamer. So I'll give him a shout out for that if he ever sees this. But otherwise, these are some general tips that I've used. And I also have a page at the very end of this form, and if you're looking at this online, or if you're just looking at this here, then this most of these would apply to just about all papers. Not all papers, but most of them. And this is where the checklist part comes in. So take a look at this at the checklist and see if you have everything that you need. So does your paper have a clear thesis? You know, a thesis is the main argument of a paper, main idea of a paper. So does it have a clear thesis? And does it answer that famous "so what" question? Look at that. And if you're reading somebody else's paper, can you find the thesis easy? If you're peer reviewing a paper, can you find the thesis easy? Is it easy to spot? Is it clear what that thesis is? And could you reword it in your own words? So if you were to look at the paper and you saw read the introduction where the thesis usually is, and somebody asked, what is the main argument of this paper? Could you tell that person easily? And if you can't, then maybe you don't have a strong thesis, or maybe the paper doesn't have a strong thesis. You always want to try to make sure that your argument is as original as possible. So I know with a lot of first year students that it might not be as easy to do. Later on for the upper division students, then it's going to be a little bit easier. But to be honest, original thesis, writing a thesis is difficult. It's difficult for me. I've been writing for 20 plus years now, and coming up with a good academic argument sometimes is tricky and it's hard. And as you write the paper, your ideas change a little bit, and it changes the style of the paper sometimes, and sometimes it even changes around the entire argument of the paper. So with that said, you want to think about the thesis, come back to the thesis at the end and see if it still makes sense, and then tailor your thesis around for your entire paper. To make sure that it's original and again that it makes sense. So does your paper follow the assignment? This is a very basic one, but if you're writing a rhetorical analysis and you aren't using the rhetorical terms, then yeah, your paper probably isn't following the assignment. And that would be the same thing for just about any other paper. So if you're writing a paper, or a general research paper, and you have certain requirements, then look at the requirements, look at the assignment sheet, and see if it's following the assignment sheet to the T. And if it's not, then you might want to look it up. And if you have questions, of course, ask me or ask another professor who you're using this for. Again, a lot of the tips in here are things that you could use for not just my class, but you could use this elsewhere. So are the citations used correctly? So if you're looking at the citations, are they used correctly throughout the paper? MLA format has very specific ways to do this, just like all other citation methods. Look it up. That's what we have to do. I can't memorize all of them. I know just a few of them off the top of my head, but like you, I'll have to search it. I'll break out the MLA handbook, or I'll Google search it, one of those ways. But you'll do the same thing we do, and that's just look it up. So make sure you do it. But again, make sure that you do it correctly. My advice to you on that note is to avoid those online citation builders. Sometimes they're helpful. They're especially helpful if you know what you're doing. But if you don't know what you're doing, which is the reason why a lot of people don't or use those, then you might miss things. You might mess up some parts, especially on the works cited page. So my advice to you would be just to avoid those in the first place, and learn how to do it on your own. And then if you want, use those citation builders. But otherwise, you might be messing yourself up. So next, are all the items that are listed in the works cited page in the paper itself? So this means that you're doing this simultaneously at the same time. When I look at papers, one of the first things I look at is the works cited page. I go to the works cited page and I see if you have one listing or 5 listings or whatever it is, that it matches whatever's in the paper. I want to make sure that that's the case. So make sure that you do that. So if you have something listed in the works cited page, that means that it is work that you have cited in the paper. And this is an important thing. A lot of people don't realize this early on, but the works cited page means that it is work that you have cited in the paper. Pretty basic stuff, but a lot of folks don't get this. I didn't get this when I first started school. It took a while for me to figure out, oh, that's what that means. And fairly obvious. As soon as I realized it, then I was like, oh, okay, now I know. But now if you didn't know before, that's what it means. So are all quotes introduced and integrated properly? We talked about that just a few minutes ago. Do all paragraphs have 3 sentences? This isn't grammatical, but this is a stylistic issue, with the exception of journalism, again, which is using space constraints is the issue. In almost all styles, it's important to be able to do this, because if you think of a paragraph as an idea, which is basically what a paragraph represents, then if you have an idea that's only 2 sentences long, then you don't really have a great idea. So maybe you want to merge that with whatever's coming up next in the next sentence. That said, also, so you should make sure that this paragraphs have at least 3 sentences in there, because it helps to show that you have a formulated idea. But also at the same time, If you have one paragraph and the entire paper is one paragraph, which I see occasionally, sometimes even in 3 or 4 page papers where the entire paper is one paragraph, that's way too much. I would encourage you to write shorter paragraphs. 4 or 5 sentences is sufficient for most paragraphs. This isn't a rule, but it's something that people like to see. They like to see a little bit of that space in the writing instead of, again, that wall of text, which is very intimidating for people. When you're reading a paper, to see a wall of text is often something that tells them mentally that they should go on to another paper. They should read something else, move on and get away from this wall. But, again, it's not something that has to do with style, or I should say, it doesn't have to do with grammar, but it has to do a lot more with style. Right. Do the paragraphs have clear transitions between paragraphs? What you should think of this, and I say transitions, what I mean is the last sentence in one paragraph, does it connect with the first sentence in the other paragraph? So if you think of these as ideas, each paragraph is ideas, then the transition is a bridge between one idea to the next. So you should be able to connect those directly, and they should be able to make sense if you looked at the two. They should have a direct connection between them. Does the main argument move throughout the paper? So whatever that thesis is, then the thesis needs to be the thing that's driving that paper. So essentially, almost all paragraphs in the paper are trying to argue that thesis. Otherwise, they might not have a place in that paper. So make sure that whatever your thesis is, that moves through every paragraph in the paper. Does the paper have pronoun reference issues? And that goes back to when I talked about the word it. Does it reference directly back to the pronouns? If you're using singular pronouns and other pronouns that you might not think of, words like everyone, that should be everyone, and that is a singular pronoun, even though it sounds plural. Everyone is a singular one. Everyone, someone, everybody, somebody. Those are singular pronouns, and that means the reference to another pronoun that comes after this would be either everyone should get out her pen, everyone should get out his pencil, something like that. And there may be exceptions to this, especially with increasing usage of the word there. And if that's the case, if you're using there in a singular sense, then that should be clear in the paper, just so it doesn't confuse the reader. Okay. And is the punctuation in particular semicolons and colons used correctly? Look at your papers. If you have semicolons and colons in there, just double check to make sure that you use them correctly. If you use them correctly, great. But again, a lot of people don't use them correctly. And it's one of those punctuation marks that when people see it, they look at it, and you'd be surprised how often you'll be judged by using an incorrect semicolon in your paper. So look at those, make sure that you have them, that you're using them correctly. And lastly, is the paper readable and without awkward sentences? So if you read your paper out loud, then I can almost guarantee that you'll be able to fix almost any problem that you have, any kind of problem that you have with awkward sentences, and your papers will be in good shape. So those are some tips that I have for you. Those are some tips that I created to help make you a stronger writer. Those are specifically a lot of things I'm looking for in your papers. So for your classes, if you're taking me as a professor, which you are, then almost unless somebody finds us randomly on YouTube, then if you have me in a class, then I'm giving you I'm helping you out right now, and I'm giving you everything that I'm going to be looking for in the paper. So consider this a gift for me to you, and use this accordingly. Okay. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to help out in any way. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the real world, hopefully.